Hello.
Hello.
Now, you and I have known each other for all of about 4 minutes.
It's been a big time.
Yeah. And Pastor Tara Beth, thank you for being up here. I'll notice that Miriam didn't get a footstool, which feels like something we should address with Chris McKenzie, but that's for a separate conversation.
I know where I stand, and that's fine.
I do feel a little bit like a diva right now.
Yeah, it's okay. It works. So here's where I want to just jump in based off of, I used to work at Awana. Awana is this children's ministry organization. So hearing folks talk about discipleship of kids and students like made me come alive. And the thing though that I think most people hear from this is this sense of overwhelmed. And you talked about Luke 24 as this place to really kind of start. But if we assume younger generations are absent from this faith of the conversation, if we show up thinking, as you said in your sermon, that the conversation is not already underway, what do we lose as Christ followers ourselves by making that assumption?
Yeah, I suppose if we just go straight, if we go straight within a posture that we know more and have thought more and therefore have something to bring, I bet you're going to miss out on absolutely gold about the kingdom from the person in front of you. And that's true for anyone, regardless of age. But I think one of my favorite things about when Jesus sends out the 72 is that he says, oh, don't take your stuff with you. Don't take a backpack, which in today's culture, it'd almost be like, hey, Christians, don't take your arguments with you, your very thought through apologetic questions and answers that you've created, and your I know the right way about you. And then Jesus actually says, as you go, you're going to be in a place of need because you've not got money, you've not got your food. So when somebody offers you what you need, which is a meal, stay with them. So suddenly he's just leveled the ground. He's just made this whole thing much more equal around shared humanity, sharing space. And yes, we've got the words of life, but I also need food at your table. And that actually somehow makes this whole thing way less of a power dynamic and way more of a revelation of the kingdom. And so the same with young people, they've got stuff we need.
Yeah.
So, and you could say that in any area of diversity in the church, we are poorer for not being every tribe, every tongue, every nation, every generation. We're poorer in the kingdom. We're poorer in our vision of Jesus, including with young people.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. The thing that I loved the most about what you were sharing today is people usually approach this conversation with a sense of overwhelmed. They go, I mean, yeah, I don't disagree with you, but how? And you were able to provide some real tangible examples on how you start to get over that overwhelmed. But you're also encouraging people to ask questions. And I'm curious how you are able to let go of the burden of, hey, I'm supposed to know the right answer because I'm sophisticated, I've been following Jesus longer. Like, how do you let go of again, an assumption that I'm supposed to be right so that I can teach them?
Yeah, that is that thing of we're our greatest barrier. Like we get in the way more than other people's thoughts of us. It's actually our own thoughts about us that get in the way. And I think one of the greatest ways is just tell on yourself really early. So just make it really clear, like level your expectations at the start. So if you're, hanging out with a group of teenagers and you're already feeling imposter syndrome, like you don't know what to do, you're not sure how to be here, and they're probably going to ask you something with a term you've never even heard of. It's super helpful if you're then able to just be like, oh gosh, like I'm definitely not here to know right answers. I bet I don't know lots of right answers. I'd love to have good conversation though. I'd love to try and work out even better questions to help us discover together. So out yourself early, and that actually telling on yourself really helps you because then you're like, I've got that elephant in the room out the way. Like I'm not the guru. And so then when they are just like, I'd actually really like a conversation about my relationship and what's going on with my boyfriend. Actually, that you'll then find, oh, do you know what? I actually have a story of that because that happened to me. Let me talk to you. And sometimes you go, gosh, don't know. Should we just wait a minute? Ask, like maybe pray. If they're open to that, you could be like, let's just wait a minute and see what Jesus might say to us. Or even just be like, what do you think? Get curious together. I bet you can find a lot of the gold's actually in you. So yeah, if you tell on yourself early, then you're not set yourself up to be something that you're not.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so funny because I did youth ministry here for so long, and I used to be so comfortable with younger generations, and then after a little more than a decade of being out of it, I suddenly started to feel how so many of you feel, really, really intimidated by younger generations. And when I just to put some color to it, a story for you, when I first got here to Good Shepherd 15 months ago, the Chicago Marathon launched, and I was one of those people like never going to run a marathon, never, ever going to run a marathon. Until one day, this 23-year-old young lady, Audra Deal, came up to me and said, "I'll run the marathon if you run it." And I was so intimidated and so honored that a 23-year-old wanted to run a marathon with, at the time, a 41-year-old. I said, "Yeah, I'll do it." But then the problem was she actually signed up. So I actually had to sign up for it. And I thought, what have I gotten myself into? Which, by the way, which is probably why I broke this so easily. Another story.
So thanks a lot, Audra.
Yeah, thanks,
The younger
Audra.
generation are dangerous.
But I remember, so she said, "Okay, well, I'm gonna run with you. We're gonna train together a couple times a week." And I was so intimidated. I was like, "What am I gonna do with a 23-year-old? I'm a 41-year-old pastor." I felt so intimidated of what am I gonna talk to her about? How am I gonna invest in her? And kid you not, before I would run, she doesn't even know this. Her parents are in here, and now they're going to tell her. Her boyfriend is right there, and he's going to tell her. But I kid you not, before I would run with her, I would brainstorm a list of questions to ask her, and I would put them in my notes in my phone.
That's awesome.
That's actually adorable.
Because, and I would just come up with a list of 15 questions that I could ask her that would connect with her heart to heart. And then I said to her, "Okay, Audra, we're running together. How about you do a Bible study? I can provide you a Bible study, and then we can talk about it while we are running." And because I just had to think of creative ways to connect with her, and I was so blown away at the openness, and then I was so blown away at what I gleaned and learned from her. Right. But I was intimidated too, and had to brainstorm questions to ask her in my notes on my phone.
Can I say about this question thing? So at Fusion, who I work for, we created decks of cards that are just questions because of that. So you're I've made 50 questions. So we've got 52 questions. They're a real deck of playing cards, but every card's got a good question that you could ask, and to have mentoring and discipleship relationships with younger people. So one of them is literally the discipleship deck of cards with discipleship questions. So there is no excuse for anyone of any age not to be able to sit with somebody else and have a Jesus conversation. And then the missional deck of cards is the deep and meaningful conversation deck. And so that gives you no excuse, particularly for college students, no excuse not to go beyond surface level conversation with the people that they're meeting. But we literally, that list you did on your phone, we then did as a deck of cards to genuinely, because we were getting stuck with good questions to ask, even though we all know that should be fine to do, we do get stuck. So we physically had to answer that.
My kids get home from school, and I remember I was trying to research how do I even ask my kids? And I remember one time I came across this question said, my boys were in middle school. It was a list of questions to ask your kids after school, and one of them was, "What is your teacher wearing?" Really bad question. My 7th grader looked at me and goes, "What? Why are you asking me what my teacher's wearing?"
It's weird, yeah. Don't Google everything.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
If you get nothing else from today's conversation, don't Google everything. But I loved that, and I loved the intentionality of it. In all sincerity, I think too, sometimes when we hear about a resource, if you're hearing about it in a church, there's this weird thing that we do mentally where we go "Oh, that's nice." Actually go to Fusion USA's website, actually check out that resource, actually check out what they offer, because you also said this, especially for college students, everything we're talking about is applicable to every generation of kid and student. I love that your ministry exists and you're able to create this level of specificity. I became a Christ follower in college because of folks like you. But the level of intentionality that you're describing works for the college student, it works for the middle school student, and it works for my 5-year-old running
Exactly.
around. Yeah. So there's a couple questions that came in already that I want to just immediately get to. So again, you can text in your questions as we're going. But one of the things that comes up a lot in this conversation around Gen Z and Gen Alpha particularly is there is a gap in how we talked about mental health and how they're talking about mental health. And I think most of the people who took the time to stick around would tell you they're doing it better than we did, right? They're doing it without a sense of stigma. They're doing it without a sense of shame and guilt, broadly speaking. But it's still this relatively new conversation for us as a culture. And I love the way that this got phrased, which is, when you talk about mental health and safety around our Gen Z adult children, how they process it, how we can help, and how we should or should not as parents what they should be doing to avoid enabling. And I think in those kind of 3 layers of the conversation, it speaks to this gap generationally.
So, yeah, such an important question. You know, I referenced the Relate research that just came out, and I think it's like relateyounglife.org or something, but you can find that research as well. So one of the things the Relate research did was make sure that they didn't just assume the biggest thing that's going to come out of this research is the mental health crisis of young people, because that is the most common headline and the most common assumption. Mental health featured, it actually didn't feature half as highly as people were expecting it to in that research. The other thing to say is we talk a lot about the mental health crisis in our teenagers. When it actually manifests in more severe ways is when they leave home and go to university, because their coping mechanisms and their world is then stripped away and changed at that moment of leaving home. Whether home is good or bad, leaving school, whether school was good or bad, there's a bunch of systems in place for them, even as they have their big crisis moments. It's actually contained. Then at university, it's an adult who's then, what was going on at 15 comes bubbling up at 19, and they're far from home, and they can drive, and they've got money, and they've either got friends or not checking on them. And so we are seeing this on the campus more and more and having to talk about it. The reality is, we're also dealing with in the young adult generation, and that question particularly spoke to adult Gen Z kids. You have got a bit of a weird thing going on. So the campus refers to the parents not even as helicopter parents now, but lawnmower parents, because they're trying to do everything they can to smooth the path for their children, the path of least resistance. So campuses and staff and landlords and faculty are learning how to deal with parents, not students, because parents are still involved in campus life in a way that wasn't true. Like 10 years ago, that wasn't a thing. And now mum's on the phone. If something goes wrong with the grade, the student's never spoken to the faculty member themselves. So like there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. So the question to involvement becomes a bit of a trickier one, because setting them up to be an adult also means there are these moments of Hannah giving back baby Samuel to the temple, these moments of going, I have to trust God with what I've cultivated. I can't keep being there to fix or smooth the path, when that's part of how you build resilience, is letting that tree be in a storm, letting their roots go deeper. And so when it comes to the mental health crisis, they are better at talking about it and destigmatizing it. There's less bullying at schools around it, and some of that labeling's actually helped. Like, I've got a kid who's a friend of mine. He's like my godson. He's a teenager. And when he has a nervous tic, he can name that. And because there's a famous pop star in the UK that also has this in a much stronger way, Lewis Capaldi, he's done a documentary about it. That means that whole generation at high school know it's a thing. So when my godson goes in and goes, don't worry about that, that's a nervous tic, it's just happening at the moment, all the kids go, okay. And they're cool with it in a way that I cannot imagine that would have been true in my school, 20 years earlier. So there's an understanding of it. But the flip side is there can be an embrace of all of the labels without a trajectory towards what does walking in greater wholeness and healing and health look like. And that's where, if you're talking about your adult children, you're probably not the major answer to that question. But ideally, we're cultivating our young people to be thinking, even with this label, this diagnosis, this condition, what does wholeness and fullness of life look like for me? What does it look like to pursue greater health? Even if I live with that for the rest of my life, what does fullness of life in Jesus look like? What's he inviting me into? And leaning into the support systems that do exist in the adult world, but you have to work a bit harder to find them because they don't find you in quite the same way as they do at school. So some of that comes into play as well.
Yeah, something that has given me a lot of peace in Scripture with that, when it comes to just the temptation as a parent to smooth the path or be the load bearing or handle things, is early on I realized, as a mom with a big life in ministry, a very full schedule, and living in a community where there's a lot of moms who stay home and they don't work. And so I often used to wrestle with feeling guilt that I didn't have the capacity to smooth the path out for my kids in the ways that other moms did. And so I used to feel like a bad mom because I couldn't fix everything for my kids because of my life and because of my schedule, until I read the story about Jesus getting lost as a child. For 2 days, Jesus' parents did not realize he was missing. Like, for 2 days. Like, if that happened in today's world, like, we'd be like, wow, what a, like, great parenting right there. In the ways that I feel like, wow, am I a bad mom because I can't constantly smooth the path and fix everything for my kids? And what I realized is Jesus' family, the reason why they didn't realize he was even missing for 2 whole days is because they entrusted the community, that the community had him, that the community was taking care of him, that he was safe. And so much of our role as parents is not to helicopter or to smooth the path, but trust that the community also has them and is raising them up.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really good. One of the most profound things my dad said to me when I was 7, going into primary school, because I basically
That's elementary school here.
Elementary
just
school,
really
as they say.
Sure
as they say, elementary school, y'all. There's plenty more where that came from. I just won't dare do it in front of you. I got bullied a bit because they've worked out my dad was a church leader, and it's very rare to be a Christian in the United Kingdom. And so at the time, I took a bit of a hit for being a Christian publicly, even as a kid. And I remember my dad crouching down to me and saying, "Miriam, I wish with everything in me that I could walk onto the playground with you every day, but I can't. But the one who can is Jesus." And I remember picturing Jesus as a lion. And I just thought, I'm walking around with a lion. And that didn't make me aggressive, but it made me courageous. And so I often say that to parents, to students, particularly, honestly, young women moving away from home in university culture. You can feel afraid at times. Just being like, do you remember that you walk with a lion, though? Because we actually have to build that kind of faith in our people as well. And that stuck with me ever since I was a little one.
That's awesome. Just to add something real quick, as folks who, part of that question was about enabling. And I think the 2 things that come to mind for me are when you are doing what Tara Beth and Miriam are describing, it feels initially like you are pulling back. But as a result, you are building that resiliency for them, because if you continue to do that, if you continue to be a snowplow parent, if you continue to be that level of invested, they never experience that themselves. The community around them does not get cultivated until they are forced to have to cultivate it with the lion next to them. And too often, I went to a school where there was a Christian there who called our school Sin Land, to give you an idea of what that experience was like. And he kept saying one of the differences he saw in what my experience was versus his experience was that I was intentionally forced to try to meet other believers. And that's part of why I am able to sit here, is because I had that moment of feeling like I had to depend on Jesus. And that is such a hard thing to do as a parent, but it is so critical for the long-term faith of your kid. So this other question that came in that I think addresses some of this, which is that there's this perception that Gen Z particularly is too weak, that they need to be grittier, that they need to be, as us older generations believed us to be so strong, right? Is that as big of a deal as it actually is? Like, is that sort of communication perception that Gen Z is weak actually played out in the data or in some of the pastoral conversations that you guys have?
So interestingly, Gen Z want you to see them as kind, caring, a good friend. They're actually a very empathetic, compassionate generation. So that might say more about how we view people caring for people and showing emotion, to talk about weak and soft, rather than Gen Z want to be known as the good friend generation, and they want to be known as empathetic, and they are. And that is a gift. And we have robbed our society of thinking that strength somehow means an absence of compassion, empathy, being moved. And so I think there's something going on there, and they know, because again, if you look at the research, their strong words for themselves is actually not a metric around career success, and some of the strength metrics will be like, that's a successful person. Their success is, I'm a good friend. I care for my community. I love neighbor. I love creation. Like, all of those themes come out. So that's quite striking. And the other thing I'd say is, like, resilience is that's not like just a buzzword. The schools are teaching that from a young age. Like, our teachers are brilliant. Like, that they are paying attention to the latest research, and they're helping young people self-regulate, think through their emotions. Like, I mean, I'm raised by like public school teachers, so to be honest, like, I'm going to forever just shout for them. but they do so much work around the whole child. At its best, education prepares the whole child that I just wouldn't buy it. I'm like, oh, they've all been like mollycoddled. Did you use that phrase here?
Definitely not.
Okay, mollycoddled. It's when they've just been like wrapped in bubble wrap for kept away from the world. And now they're like snowflakes. They're all just melting under the sun of the real life. I'm like, no, I think that's not fully true. But I do think we've undervalued beautiful gifts in this generation, like empathy.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Amen. So, and it requires that level of proximity, right? I think so much of this conversation comes down to folks looking at discipleship of kids and students as if that is someone else's problem, if that is someone else's job, because we've outsourced, I outsource my kid going to soccer practice so I can outsource the discipleship to this generation. And a lot of the questions that have come in play into this idea of what's the role of parents. And you working in a parachurch organization, trying to partner with...
Pro-church, actually.
Forgive me.
We call it pro-church just because it doesn't quite make sense to say parachurch because we don't do anything outside the local church. So a church leader said, do you know what? I think I describe you as pro-church. And I thought, I'll take that.
Yes. Okay. You work in a pro-church organization because there is this level of we can cross the bridge first. We can cross that divide first because parents so often feel... like parents who are young parents feel this sense of overwhelm and the sense of, I don't know how to do this. But ultimately, parents have the sense of responsibility. There's this question that came in of, these are nice things to talk about, but at a certain point, there's levels of respect or obedience that come into the conversation that are unique to the home that don't necessarily have to play out in the church. If I'm a parent hearing this conversation, I guess to put it in a broad way, is there any difference to what we're describing? Is discipleship as a parent any different than how you're walking this through in more of a church leader perspective?
Well, I mean, Tara Beth will be able to speak to this more than me because she's further along the journey, but it's a slightly funny dichotomy if we think that we talk about the family of God, the people of God, the house, and then we somehow think our home life and our private life in some ways shouldn't be affecting and reflecting one another. I would be slightly concerned... Well, I would be very concerned if a church leader's public persona had nothing to do with how they cultivate life at home. Similarly, for those of us that have been given the care of children, whether adopted or grandparents or living with them in community or, biological parents or whatever, that is like the birthplace of our discipleship. Not only, obviously, for anyone that's had a kid, you just know that they just read you like a book. Like that the greatest therapy is having a child and then being like, oh, good gracious, like I'm seeing all of my stuff reflected back at me in a newborn. Help me, Lord. Or, as my mum says, you get the kids you deserve. As my toddler melts down in Publix and you're just like,
that's amazing.
Oh, wicked. Mum said I only chose to tantrum in church, libraries and supermarkets. And I was like, here we go. So there's an element where it's all discipleship. It's all discipleship. If we're going to use the language of family, that is a high bar, actually, particularly for people outside of the faith who come in here. And so I do recognise church hurt has also happened if someone's come in and we've told them they're family and then we've actually been absent fathers and mothers, or we've prioritised biology totally and ignored the kid that's come in the room without mum and dad. That's a whole thing that's tricky. And the reality is I don't have the same authority over your child's life than you do. In fact, the stats show all the way into their early 20s, in the US, kids' number one source of where to go to for advice and guidance is mum. Followed by, it goes dad is fourth, it's slightly higher. Slightly higher depending on the different demographics, but mum has a huge amount of influence. I didn't realise, I wasn't expecting this to come up in the graph. And friends are there on day-to-day problems, but in the big crisis moment, it's mum and then siblings and then dad. It's family is massive in this generation, even into their adult years. And so actually working out how we be the people and model and learn family together on a mission here and at the home have got to be related. Otherwise, we've sort of divided up our life in a way when we're whole people. But family's a really big deal. You think your kids' greatest influence is their friends. It's not. They have an influence. Oh, and the other one in their adult years is romantic partner. So mum the person I'm dating or married to, siblings, dad, friends come later, which I wasn't expecting. But yeah.
Pastor Tara Beth, when you're having those conversations with folks who, maybe they just sent off their kid to college, I would imagine that some of these fears come up quite a bit. How are you able to help sort of give some of this truth that Miriam's describing, but also meet them where they're at?
Yeah, and just a little plug. You and I talk about this in the podcast that's airing
probably 3 weeks from right now.
3 weeks from right now. We spent a whole podcast talking about this 3 weeks from now. But so I think oftentimes we think of discipleship in the home as a program, as a workbook, as something that I buy, that we go through, that we study, that we read. And while that is effective, for us in our home, discipleship is the life on life. It's in those everyday, ordinary moments when we're in the kitchen and we're doing dishes and the boys begin to have a little bit of a spat or a fight. And we bring them back to something that we say 4 times a day. What's the most important thing? Love God, love your neighbor. It's, in the morning when they leave for school, we say to them, what's the most important thing that you do today? Love God, love your neighbor, and try your best. And then we lay hands on them and we pray for them. It's everyday, ordinary. It doesn't always have to be this cognitive moment where they are just taking in information. Discipleship is not just memorizing or taking information or making sure that they have so many scriptures memorized. Those things are really, really good. But I like to think of it more as a weaving of in and out, of driving down the road and reflecting, of having conversations when they do come to you in crisis. Like that is discipleship. That is discipleship.
Yeah. One of the things that I think comes up so often in conversations like these is this sense of parent guilt, this sense of I should be doing more as a parent. I should be doing what I see this other parent doing. And one of the best pieces of advice my wife Lauren and I got was each kid, each year. Because it spoke to this, not only the way that a lot of parents wind up falling into this trap of, oh, I need to do the same thing for the middle child that I did for the oldest or the youngest that I did for the other ones. The other ones, I have 3, I've lost track. But that's not actually a thing. And by taking the time to know each of your kids, those ordinary moments are going to be slightly different, but equally important. And I hope that sense of shame that we all pile on ourselves as parents, especially young parents, becomes less when you think about it, discipleship that way.
My friend, I was speaking to my friend, a guy called James the other day, and he said to me, Miriam, up until the age of 12, I raised my son a bit like a dog. That sounds awful. Wait for it. He was just an incredibly lovable, obedient, puppy-like character. And so there was nothing that his son wouldn't do. And he just performed incredibly well. This guy's a pastor as well. And he was like, that's actually not going to set me up for success in his teens if all he does is know how to do really well at the things he's being asked to do, particularly in public, particularly in church circles. And he's adored because he's obedient. And so he said, we completely changed our parenting tack at age 12 to really clear, values-based and communication-based. And so they ended up agreeing the 5 big family values that they stand by. And it was things like generosity and joy and love a neighbor and stuff like that. And then the big conversations where he said, if this wasn't going to be where your life was going, this would require a conversation, because I've realized I have expectations on you that I've not communicated. They're mine. They might not be yours. They might not be fair, but I have to communicate them so that we don't end up embittered in your teens when you're not doing what I thought you'd do. So he did this whole different way of values and communication, even basic things, but he was like, I actually expect you to go to university, and I've never told you that, and you might not. So instead of expectation not meeting in reality, massive room for division in the home, now that's a conversation that we have, and we check in every year if that's still the road that you think you're on. So I actually found that really practical, because I was like, oh yeah, in some ways you would just want to, if they look obedient, they're doing well, and particularly when everyone else's eyes are on you, you might feel like you're doing really well, but that might not set you up for being a family full of values and honesty in those crisis moments compared to being a puppy.
Yeah.
I'm a golden retriever.
And that was evident by the impression. It was a golden retriever. That's because taking the time to communicate can also often feel awkward. But what I love in that story of the fact that it was someone who was 12 is it's never too late to have that conversation. It's never too late to try to take things that you maybe felt like were understood and take the time to actually communicate them and make sure they're understood. And that is so valuable. It's funny because the next text that came in was actually about my lack of communication, which is actually making sure we define these generations we're speaking of. I want to make sure there's no confusion in how we're talking about this. So also, I think it's important because when we talk about Gen Z, I think sometimes we picture a person who is a lot younger than sometimes Gen Z can actually be. So just real quick, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they also talked about defining boomers, so good luck with that. But also, how do these different generations break down?
Yeah, and again, you can Google it. There's so much research on this. And some people will give you very specific numbers. So, for example, the boomer generation, the very specific numbers that were in that definition I read earlier was 1946 to like 1964. It was like something like that, where it's like literally post-war and then basically 20 years. And so then that's my mum and dad squarely. I am squarely in the middle of millennial. I'm 35. I'm fully a millennial. My younger millennial friends are around 30 and very late 20s, right?
And I'm a geriatric millennial.
Right, exactly. So an elder millennial.
Yes, I'm like the oldest millennial.
Whereas my husband's 44, he was born in 1980. That's the start of Gen X. Again, it's such a blurred line. I'll tell you, when you read some of the generational trends, and this isn't like weird horoscope type stuff, it's just some generational trends, okay? So it's not scripture, but it can be helpful. I know my husband's actually Gen X, whereas Tara Beth actually comes across more like a millennial. But even though it's on the cusp, really. But so that's when you start to notice some people will lean that way or that way in those blurred lines. After Gen X, you've got the millennials, and that's when, like, at the turn of the millennium, we were coming into our teens. And so this whole birth of the digital age massively shaped our formation, because even the studies of adolescence would now tell you are an adolescent still forming your opinions, your ethics, your faith, your identity up until your late 20s, which is why we do what we do with helping churches think about young adults, because they're not just regular adults yet. They're still forming for much longer than our parents were used to, which is another reason why parents freak out. We're getting married a decade later than my parents. That freaks parents out. It's normal for us. But that's a massive shift in a short amount of time that my grandma's like, what are you doing? Do you know what I mean? Like, you've perished, and I'm 24. And all my school friends are like, are you joking? Anyway, very interesting. And so then Gen Z, so we're then talking Gen Z's at university right now, but Gen Alpha's just starting off. Gen Z are then in their 20s, their late teens. Gen Alpha are probably in your kids' work at the moment. They're in school right now, and they're coming through. So again, the lines are a bit arbitrary. You can actually Google specific dates, and people will give you slightly differences, but they'll be within a sort of 4-year margin. They'll go, that's basically when the transition years are, and then that's definitely that generation.
And it's one of those things that's really helpful just to take a little bit to learn more about yourself, because it's the thing that you'll see those traits in yourself. I don't know if you guys have this experience, but when I read characteristics about millennials, I'm never taking in we're really innovative and those kinds of things. I'm just reading all of the terrible characteristics, and it's like, oh, that sounds like my diary. That means that is me, right? But it also, when you're having that conversation, I always feel like parents today are looking at kids and going like, man, you guys are on a different planet. And the answer is, yeah, they are. The amount of change that has happened for today's kids is so drastically more exponential than it was for previous generations that they wind up having a different experience. And you can choose to either just look at them like they're a different species, or actually lean into the conversation by doing something as simple as learning some of these definitions. One of the other things that you talked about, though, in your sermon this morning was staying curious. And I think it's such a helpful posture in life, but especially in these types of conversations, because how do you stay curious after getting hit with, okay, boomers yourselves, but also, when they're ghosting you, when they're saying things that feel downright heretical, but hey, I'm supposed to wait and before and listen more without jumping in. How do you keep that posture of curiosity yourself?
Oh gosh. Well, I've certainly not done that. I've definitely messed this thing up along with any normal person. I remember once oh gosh, college students are amazing, but they are also a nightmare, do you know? And so like, I remember once sitting opposite one and he wanted to ask me some theological questions. And I was like, okay, that's okay, we can have this chat. It's just a lad in my local church. And then trying to get curious, I sort of said, well, you know, what do you think of this teaching in Scripture? And he was like, oh yeah, no, I don't agree with it. So I'm just going to disregard the whole of the Old Testament, won't bother with it. And I was just like, right. Like, you know, I found it so difficult to just be like, because the truth is that I don't think that's fine. So I'm also not going to not be honest. Like, I'm not going to sit there and be like, you do you, pal. Because that's inauthentic and it's not good discipleship. So I'll be like, I'm really interested to know how, like, where you think Scripture and the authority of Scripture actually lands in your life if you're willing to take the majority of the book and bin it. Genuinely, I'm interested in that. So then I was like, we've got to get into a bigger conversation of what authority do you have over your life bigger than you, if anything. But I had to be very careful and watch myself because there was part of me that wanted to get defensive and be like, that is terrible. Like, what a stupid thing to say. Like, how are you even following Jesus if you just chucked away the Bible? Then I'm like, that is obviously very judgmental. So getting curious has often meant I've had to ask another question to give myself a beat, to work out, don't judge him. He's in the middle of a process here. But I am allowed to challenge that. Yeah. Like, I've even had teenagers say to me before, Miriam, does God agree with me on this? Because if he doesn't agree with me on this, I don't follow God. And I'm like, that is just not the posture. That's not the right question. But I can't say that. So I have to get curious with them on, so would you only follow a God that agrees with everything you agree with already, that you've sort of designed? Like, how is that God? Like, I have to get curious with them. Because my reaction is like, that's a nightmare what you've just said. So yeah, I'm not perfect at it. I'm learning as well.
Yeah. And I think it's even just taking the second to admit that last part, right? That you don't do this well all the time. I think frees up folks who are listening. And if you're just listening to the podcast, you should know that there's 12,000 people here with us. Because we assume that everyone does. We assume that I assume that every other conversation my kid's having is with an adult who's more qualified, smarter, and easier to talk to. And recognizing that that's just not a realistic expectation, nor is it actually helpful to the long-term discipleship. I love this community because there's been a few questions that have come in that are not about themselves, but it's about how they help bring other adults into this conversation. Oh, that's so cool. There's one of these that is about, how can I lead peers in this community in a way that helps teach this kind of parenting, this weaving in discipleship, this normal kind of parenting? So Pastor Tara Beth, to start with you, I think if I'm hearing this and I'm feeling a sense of burden, both for myself, but also for peers, bringing other people into along, where does my role in this end and God's role begin, or vice versa, if that's theologically heretical?
Yeah, you know, it's so much of it is that just life on life, like rubbing shoulders together. And I think a great starting point is that breaking of bread. That's what we see Jesus do. You've heard me say Jesus ate his way through the New Testament. Like, he ate his way through the Gospels. And it's just a fantastic study to do of how many times Jesus was breaking bread with someone that he didn't know, alongside of his disciples, showing his disciples the way of the kingdom. And every time Jesus ate at the table, he was making this proclamation of the kind of kingdom he was coming to establish. And in the same way, when we bring our peers along at the table and we invite others to the table, we are showing them the kind of kingdom that Jesus came to establish. And so I think just even a very practical takeaway is throw some parties. Open your doors, throw a picnic, break the bread, invite people along and show them at the table what that looks like. And as Miriam said, watch out, it gets pretty contagious.
Yeah. I absolutely love the heart for that to have been asked, because that's discipleship again. It's invite one more, go get your brother, go tell your sister. And the reality is, at the moment, and this is a lovely sweeping statement for you from somebody that's not American, speaking to the American church, as if I've got any authority to do that. When I speak to our college student pastors in local churches, which is still a very rare breed, like most churches don't have somebody in that role yet. That's the prayer that we change. Or I speak to on-campus ministers. They say to me, Miriam, we're all well and good with like making disciples of young adults and even having them in the church community. We actually don't know how to send them to the adults because we don't want them to like break them or like judge them out the building or be a nightmare.
Oh, wow.
And so then they're like, how do we convince our senior pastors to do some discipleship with the grown-ups so that they're then trustworthy to receive a 20-year-old who's just come to faith on campus and come to church for the first time? And I keep hearing this. I've literally had people ask me, this resource doesn't exist yet. They've said, when are Fusion doing a training resource for adults around how to disciple the kids? I wasn't asked that in the UK, so that's not a thing yet. But we're actually we've done our first sort of pilot parent conversations around grown-ups having conversations with other grown-ups to get some of our stuff out in safe environments to talk this through before you're then going live with a 17-year-old. And so I would say, if you've got friends that you're thinking of, a really easy way to start the conversation is to send them the podcast and be like, I'd actually love a chat about this. I listened to this. Do you mind? Or even my sermon, because then that's super easy, because you can be like, she's a bit weird. What do you think? Because you know what I mean? So you're not going to see me again. And then when they're like, she was actually great, that's really challenged me, then you can be like, good, me too, I was joking. Let's have a chat. But do you know what I mean? But like, I would be looking at some ways to ice break with your peers, because peer-to-peer learning doesn't stop at any age, and that really helps to get that first bit going before you then widen it out and try it with some real-life younger people. Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, this question comes in about, actually, Pastor Jake, come on up here real quick. Okay. Everybody give it up for Pastor Jake as I'm improvising here on the fly. One of the things that stands out to me about some of the uniqueness of this church particularly is we are a church that is able to equip. Shout out to Max Shewy. Max is actively discipling this generation that we're talking about. But we also have to do the work of connecting with other adults. And Pastor Jake, you have a lot of youth ministry experience as well. What I'm curious about for you is how you've seen this kind of conversation change. Because I think to what's already been discussed so far, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there wasn't even this level of awareness that this was a thing. And now it feels like one of the most critical conversations the church can be having.
Can you just repeat that for the recording, please? That sound. This is what he did.
I don't think it's on.
Oh. All right. Well, everyone, thanks Pastor Jake for their time. No.
All right. Good?
Hey.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so as a youth pastor, the first thing that was, I think difficult is, as a young pastor coming into my first church, I wasn't trusted already because I was young. Like, the demographic and the conversations before I even came on the scene was, you're not trusted, so let's put you in a room with little resourcing, little support, and let's you try to reframe this generation because we don't want to do that work. And so you look at church budgets over the last 10 years, the most underfunded part of most budgets is their youth ministry. It's what they pay their youth pastors. And so they were already like, we're going to set you up for success. No, they weren't. They were waiting because I was a renewable resource that can just be replaced by some other fresh person that doesn't need health care because they can still be on their parents' health care thanks to Obama for 26 years. And then you were kicked off of it at some point because they just keep replacing you out of seminary or undergraduate. Ouch.
Yeah.
It hurt.
Yeah.
And then you lived into that stigma. And it took a while for me to be a part of a church that saw me as someone that needed to be invested in, that wanted to get ahead of the curve. It was a church in Oregon that was already in a very de-churched post-Christian society where the rest of the United States, specifically the Midwest, where, Sundays are still pretty cornered out for services and things kind of stop still unless you're doing travel sports. But that church took the initiative and we're like, no, you are leading. We're going to invest in you. And that helped start those conversations. And I've seen that shift it's the difference between thinking on your toes and being on your heels, being able to prep and plan for the work of what the Spirit is doing instead of reacting to the changes in the culture and realizing that you're a decade behind.
Yeah.
Wow.
So for me and my experience, I've got to see the shift where churches are like, no, let's give you our pulpit. Let's invest in you. Let's have you preach, come and sit and let's talk through this. Let's resource you. Let's help pay for your education. Let's put people alongside you, get you in cohorts. And so the church, by and large, is doing a much better job than when I was coming into ministry, not all that long ago. And so it's been really fun to realize that churches are understanding that people of all demographics are worth investing in, and that we learn valuable things from one another because we are better together, because we've done enough time of spending time apart, tearing each other down. Our political scene over really the last 8 years has really told that story of what a world turned against one another really looks like. And it's not something that people, to use your words, you can't flourish there.
Yeah.
So that's been a little bit of like my lived experience as a pastor, being a youth pastor, and now in the role that I am, is the church is shifting. Not every church, but I see a church shifting in the sense of like they want to be a part of the solution. We have mourned our Christian-centric society, and we've embraced, we're in post-Christendom, where throughout Scripture in the exile, they're like, yeah, go live, have babies, like make your living amongst people and let your presence be a benefit to them.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I see here as a new pastor at Good Shepherd. I see people leaning across aisles and tables, and it's been fun.
Yeah. And even right there, it's one of those things. I remember talking to a pastor from Portland, and he's John Mark Homer. He would go to churches in...
I just love that you were going to try and be subtle there, and then you just dropped
I realized
a
there was no
massive
point
name.
in that. Yeah.
I just someone off of Portland, don't want to talk about it, but it's John Mark Homer. That's a flex. I don't want to talk about it. Don't want to talk about it, but
sometimes
it was
you
the
drop
Pope.
a name.
Drop? Yeah, name
sometimes
drop.
you drop a name.
I was talking to the Pope, and it was not a big deal, but it's fine. Yeah, go on. Sorry, mate. What were you saying? Were your best friend?
It's
best
good.
friend?
It's
best
good.
friend, John Mark Homer.
At 1:30, my roast starts, so stick around for that. But his point was this, which was, and a few of these questions that have come in speak to this. Your kids are in that culture. It doesn't matter where this post-Christian culture. It doesn't matter how Bible belty of a part of the country you live in, or how Bible belty of a home you live in. Because of the internet and because of the advancement that our kids are trying to figure out, your kids are in this post-Christian culture. And having this awareness from that conversation has to be the starting place, because it allows you not to be top down in your conversation. It allows you not to try to speak to them in a culture that they just are not operating in. I'm so grateful that you guys have been texting in, because one of the key shifts that have happened throughout this conversation is we've had people start going like, okay, but like, what are the kids supposed to do? And there's been a couple of these questions, so I'm going to read this one verbatim, which is, as a student, how do we respond to our theological thoughts being shut down to someone who is older and more experienced, having different ideas or different points of view? Like, how do they respectfully challenge these ideas without seeming like they're challenging their authority?
I really want Jake to speak to I really want Jake to just speak about that. Yeah. No, Jake, speak into your insight around doubt, because doubt being a sin is just not true. But Jake's got some profound thoughts around discipling this generation with doubt as a gift and doorway to faith, not a problem.
I, growing up, grew up in a faith where there's these propositions that you agree to. And as long as you agree to those propositions, you're good to go. If you have questions about those propositions, then your faith is in question. Your heart is in jeopardy, because not only are you questioning these propositions, you're now questioning the Bible, you're questioning Jesus, and you're questioning the structures of authority that you live and breathe your faith in. So being a youth pastor, one of the things that I found very helpful is my students shaped the trajectory of what we talked about. They shaped our ministry. We would put together a student leadership team that was made up of juniors and seniors, because it's twofold. We wanted them to shape and lead their peers, but I also wanted more one-on-one conversations so they can help and shape me as a pastor, because I needed them. I still am a generation removed from some of my students, and they were boots on the ground, lived experiences of what I was teaching to, or at times what they were teaching to. And so for me, it's creating spaces where voices are heard. You have to have that, because if not, people don't speak. Or if they do, you get the anonymous factor, which is fine. That's encouraged as well. But to be honest, like pastors, once we see an anonymous letter or a post, like automatically, like the value of it drops for us, because we get a lot of those, and they're often not overly becoming. They're just not.
That was so kind.
Yeah, I just thought I would tie that up in a bow.
Nice.
Little side joke for the staff here. But creating spaces where students can actually be heard. And you have to create those spaces. You have to create spaces where they get to actually speak and listen and be heard. And your posture, which I love, is you're curious. You're listening. Because God, who's speaking to me, is speaking to them. They're coming to church because they're seeking, they're wanting, they want to be here. They could be anywhere else. They don't have to be at church, but they're choosing to be in our church. Create spaces for them to speak. And that's been, for me, as a youth pastor in the past, the best way of creating a youth ministry that my students felt comfortable inviting their friends to. Because what's the point of having a faith that isn't good news? It is good news. It has to be good news. And so if you're a student, go to Colin, go to Max. We serve the church. Your voice matters. And so you can be the catalyst that creates a much better platform moving forward that may have been denied students or generations before you. And you get to right some wrongs. Not that it was intentionally wronged, but you get to create a better way moving forward. Because your voice, oh my goodness, it matters. It absolutely matters.
As you know, putting myself sort of in the shoes of a young person, then opposite somebody much older than me, who's maybe got a seminary degree, but I actually disagree with their theology, and what do you do about that? And that sort of managing up situation of which I definitely was in when I was a college student, particularly around this is a real obvious one to pick, but if you think women can speak and lead in church, and then you're with somebody that's got far more qualifications than you that fundamentally disagrees, that's very intimidating when you're going, oh, I just didn't realize that somebody would double down on that, whereas that was something I just didn't question or whatever. And so I would say, if as a young person, I just do a little test to just see whether they're actually up for the conversation or not before you waste your time. Without being outrageous, but the whole pearls to swine stuff, genuinely, I'd have a little check and be like, would you be willing to read this article or listen to this podcast, or if you're really bold, give them a book, but something where that would shape that other opinion as a third voice, which is much easier for you both to reflect upon and critique and discuss together because you've just taken it out of the personal camp. You've not gone, unless you're Tara Beth, you don't go read my book on this. But the rest of us go read Tara Beth's book on this. Yeah. And then what if we both, which is great, by the way. Too. Yeah, sign it, sell it, let's go. Then you've got a test, because if they already know what they know and they're not going to change their mind, then you actually know that's the end of the road for that conversation. So don't worry, it's actually not yours to do. If they're like, I've never even heard of that person. Well, thank you for sharing that with me. That looks interesting. I will read that. And then you can go, great, let's follow up in a week's time. That is potentially a game changer. Firstly, you've just stopped othering one another, because now you're going to meet with different opinions and hear one another out. And you will genuinely learn robust theological things that you don't agree with, that somebody has thought through. And you still don't agree with them, and that's okay. But I would just say test the water, because then you'll know if they've got the agenda of curiosity or the agenda of correction, and that makes all the difference to your conversation.
Oh my goodness. Also, you said this earlier that I just wanted to highlight, never underestimate the power of prayer. I talk to so many parents who are mourning what they perceive to be a prodigal child. And then I talk to so many folks who sit on stages like this, talk on stages like this, who were that prodigal child and had a parent that was praying for them that they can point to and go, that's why I'm here. And if you don't have access to that relationship, whether it's your own kid, whether it's a kid in your life that you're concerned about, we still, as Christ followers, have that as a first mandate to be praying for specific folks that you are connected to, because that could be the exact thing that God's asking you to do in that moment. I want to do two things as we begin to land the plane here. One, I want to call out the time, which is this is around the time that we said we were going to be wrapping up. So if you are sitting here going like, man, I can't wait for that bearded guy to stop talking, feel free to head out whenever you need to. But also because we're going to talk about...
It's two beards, but like one's like more questionable.
Yeah, more noticeable. Yeah.
Wah, wah.
Yeah, it's all right. We're gifted differently. Yeah, it's a beard and a half. Nice.
It's something.
Here's where I want to talk, like land the plane here. One of the things that I feel like younger folks are able to call out in a way that we couldn't is this level of hypocrisy that they see in the church. This was something that came directly, which is coming from a student perspective. How do we get other students to get involved in life of the faith? And how do we navigate Christians who don't reflect Christian values in their lives? Like, this was something that I felt like if you were growing up in the church in a previous generation, you probably didn't even feel like you could speak to that. And this is a primary barrier that this generation is feeling from even walking into the doors of this place.
Hey, firstly, yeah. Secondly, getting honest about that, like straight up naming to your friends, just like, the amount of church hurt I apologize for, even though it's not mine, or the amount of, this will sound bad, but so the American and the UK relationship, disproportionately, we affect one another. So the UK is in a very different place to you guys in lots of ways, but what you do hits us massively, and vice versa. And that's been true throughout revival history. That's been true throughout sort of pioneer ministries and church renewal movements. The States has blessed our land incredibly, and it's also been a nightmare. So, for example, even when you guys hit the news, or like there's a televangelist scandal, my friends in a UK playground at school would ask me about that as the one Christian they knew, and I'd have absolutely no clue what to do with what had come out here in some very well-known famous rich person that also proclaimed the name of Jesus, because it was so discordant to my experience, but that was their impression of the church. You've got a very loud voice, America, both on our public transport and into the culture. And so just recognizing that's important.
Yeah.
But firstly, I just learned to be okay with saying, I am so sorry for what the church has done to you, or for the hurt that you felt. And owning, we have not reflected Jesus. That is not actually a reflection of Jesus, but I recognize in his name it's been done. And so as a Christian, I have to own them as part of the family, even though it would be like the most awkward birthday party if we were in the same room. The reality is, I'm sorry. I remember once I was at a bookshop, and the woman on the cash register, I often like to ask people about their tattoos as a great way to ask a good question. Got curious. She had a tattoo on her wrist that said, "This is water." And I said to her, "Oh, that's so interesting. Where's that from?" And she said it was from this amazing graduation speech that somebody gave. You can Google it. It is actually an amazing speech. And it's about an awareness of the water that we're all swimming in, and how that you only realize in the middle of the culture, hold on, this is all water. And it's about basically coming awake to the world. And so I said to her, "Are you a person of faith?" Which in the UK, that's very, no one is really, so it's quite interesting. Like, are you a person of faith? Because that sounds like quite a kind of God perspective on things. She looked at me and she said, "I will never go to church because my mum turned up pregnant with me, walking into a church seeking help, and they turned her away because she wasn't married. I will never step foot in one of those buildings with those people." And she had tears in her eyes immediately. And I looked at her and I said, "I would like to apologise on behalf of the church. I'm actually a Christian." She looked at me like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I'm like, no. It's all on me on this. On behalf of the church that I would call home, on behalf of the people that I would call family, that is devastating to me that we treated you not in the way that Jesus would have welcomed your mother. Jesus would have welcomed your mother with open arms, to be cared for in an intergenerational family, and cultivated you and celebrated the life that was coming. And I'm so deeply sorry. And it's that sort of holy moment where I'm like, what I'm actually doing is deconstructing, well, the Spirit's deconstructing the walls so that next time she comes across a glimpse of Jesus, she can see him clearer. Because a wall of pain and of judgment rightly put upon us, we just help take some of those bricks out so the light could get in. And so with young people in America, I'm consistently, when the Christians are like, the Christians are the problem, I'm like, I know, we've got to try and name it, own it, apologize for it when we can, and then speak of the way of Jesus that we're trying to find in the midst of it. Go in with honesty. I'm trying to work it out too. I'm trying to keep a soft heart and a strong heart around following Christ and being part of his church in this nation. Genuinely right now, it is harder to do that here than in Europe. For me personally, I find that. I'm trying and I'm learning, and I invite those people into that journey rather than be like trying to be the best PR company for Jesus. Ugh, don't do that. Just get real.
There's nothing I'm going to say that's better than that. So I want to thank you guys so much for taking a part of this. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Everybody give it up for Miriam one more time. And I say this on the podcast, so we'll talk to you all next week.
Hey, Ross, one more thing. Where can people who are listening and the people here learn more about Fusion
Oh my
USA?
gosh. Go to Fusion USA's website right now. Like, it's fusionusa.com, yeah?
FusionUSA.us, because we couldn't afford the better one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Fusion.
One day I'll afford a .org, but I don't have the money for it. FusionUSA.us, and on there you can find resources. None of our resources are like content, they're all like relational training, but like resources for training your high school seniors to leave home and flourish in faith at university, how to like disciple young people and plant like missional small groups with young adults. Those discipleship decks, the decks of cards, that's what you're going to want to get going on this. That's all on the website as well. And then just feel free to reach out to us. If you or someone you know resonates with this idea of the church reaching the next generation, we're here to help.
Amen. Thank you guys, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran. And our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.